Hey everyone, so I'm back on the Mark Straw Trail today in Sedona, Arizona. I'm going to be working on an 11 by 14 size panel. It's ampersand gesso board. I'm going to be using a palette knife from start to finish. This was a suggestion by a friend of mine, an amazing painter, Tad Retz. So if you don't know of him, check him out. And what I learned was that the palette knife really helps us to really find the forms in the scene. And for me, it really also helped to kind of separate value from color. And it was just a lot of fun. So I wanted to film the process and share it with you. Specifically, I consider working with values in the scene because I know some people here have mentioned wanting some guidance with that. And so the process is really catered to finding the values in the natural environment and when you're working in plein air. So hope this helps with that, and thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy this fun video and this new exercise that I'm experimenting with a little bit, and I hope you give it a try as well. So when I've selected the scene that I want to paint, I'll take a photo and then I'll just put a black and white filter over it so that I can kind of judge the values against what I think I'm seeing out in nature. I'd also like to preface this video with the fact that not the entire painting is done with exclusively a palette knife. I'm still using my other techniques with staining, washing, wiping away, and using brushes. So I do use palette knives throughout the entire process, but I am still using my other tools. I normally do this kind of orangey mixture as a stain, and lately I've been enjoying wiping away the lightest areas of the painting to figure out where my main masses are going to go. And this kind of helps me to loosely translate the scene. Sometimes when we're working with just sketching it in right away, we can get tricked into wanting to capture some of those details or not being super confident when we're laying out the design. But wiping away helps me to treat the piece more sculpturally and really decide what it is my focus is going to be, and generally helps me to create more engaging compositions and stick with them. So now that I've kind of washed out where the focal point of the scene is, I can kind of lay in a loose sketch over it. Sketching really just helps me to create a placement for the design. And I've tried painting without it. Sometimes it works, but I'm generally more comfortable when I have a few lines to organize the scene. And so I've got these big cliff features. I've got a little bit of sky with some clouds to create balance, since there's that slight slope, that diagonal at the top. And then I've got some of that red rock leaning you in from the foreground too. So I've got a little foreground and sky element, but the cliffs are taking up the most space in the scene. And that just contributes to making them feel a lot more monumental. And this is what's cool about the palette knife. So now that I've blocked out where my lightest lights are, now I'm going to put my darkest darks in with the palette knife. And I'm not going to worry about all the transitions in the shadow, which sometimes I do right away. I'm just going to worry about blocking in those masses of what I'm perceiving to be the darkest darks in the painting. So This is super helpful. Usually when we enter the block-in phase of the painting, we don't necessarily have the design totally figured out yet, so we can get into noodling around early on, and that's what, for me, kind of kills the painting if I'm not totally clear on structure. So because this is kind of a complicated rock face feature, I'm just super simplifying it into these big masses of dark and light. And, you know, when I finish the two largest masses, I can work on the smaller ones. As you can see, I'm kind of pulling that shadow down now, finding where those lower rock formations have the shadow band as well. And I'm not really worrying about warm or cool, you know, reflected, light, cast shadow. I'm just doing like basic masses of the dark and achieving this through the Alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and cadmium lemon yellow, maybe a little bit of the cad red. Basically just all my primaries. And that's, you know, kind of how I mix black and brown on my palette and gray, but, you know, really more reading as a black right now in the scene. So you can see that wash kind of stands for what I'm perceiving the middle ground to be. The areas where I've put in the palette knife so far are what I'm perceiving to be the darkest areas of the scene. Where I've wiped some of that wash out is how I feel the lightest lights are appearing. So you can see that in the photo, lightest light, middle ground, darkest dark. And then of course there's all these transitions. There's highlights, accents, transitions, like I said. So all of that evolves along with the painting. Normally, we see the sky as being always the lightest, one of the lightest planes in the painting, which it is. But if you look at the scene, the cloud and the faces of the rocks are lighter than both the sky and the ground plane. So I've grouped the sky into that middle value. And it does get a little lighter towards the horizon, continues to, you know, deepen as it goes upward. And I've really got like a nice cerulean base for my sky mixture. I've added a little bit of that mixture I created for the wash in there to desaturate a little bit. Little amounts of alizarin crimson too, so it's not overly warm. Still have some cool notes in the sky. And I've got a really pretty gray, so basically that mixture I just described without really the cerulean. And then you can see that white is just very light. Putting that in with the palette knife because, you know, even if we carve out space for the clouds, it always picks up some of that sky color. It becomes hard to differentiate. So the palette knife really helps to block in that light shape. And then of course you can blend it in and soften the edges with a brush when you've got that placed. And then I can work into the shadow on the base of the clouds with a brush. I can work on, yeah, like feathering it into the sky. I can go back in with the palette knife, you know, if I start losing that light quality of the clouds. I mean, you know, you can see in the video footage the value difference between the clouds and the sky. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but if you don't have a camera accessible to take a photo, or, you know, sometimes I don't really like taking pictures while I'm out painting, what really helps also to gauge the values is to really squint. And you can say, oh yeah, so that is grouped lighter, that's grouped darker, because you have so much information coming in that squinting really helps to see the values more clearly when masses are more blurred together. And now the ground plane, I feel, is lighter. The slick rock or the red rock in those rolling hills are going to be lighter. So it's kind of mirrored. The ground is mirroring what the sky is doing. I feel like the vegetation, the sloping vegetation, is a little bit darker than the slick rock. So that's got more white mixed into the red rock color that I made. You can pick up on all the different shades of green in these hills. And I'm mixing a nice transition with the palette knife between that kind of grayish green in the foreground and where the deep dark blue shadow meets it. So picking up some saturation where those two planes meet, as well as making it more of a middle tone so it blends more nicely on the eye. You can see that hillside receding into the shadow lines. The palette knife really helps, you know, I intuitively mix my colors as I go, which I'm doing with the palette knife, but it really helps me to be very clear about which colors I'm picking up because I'm kind of mixing bigger quantities of them. I've also mixed a really nice kind of brown that's going to go into those red rock shadows. So you can see I've got the different layers of sandstone. The ones that are lower are more of that red orangey color. And then the lighter faces of the cliffs that are higher up are more of that like kind of white, yellowish gray. And so popping some of those lights back into the shadow, and I'll kind of be going back and forth a lot. I don't want to lose that, you know, beautiful dark quality in the shadow planes that I've created. So you really have to be very exact with the shade that you're creating. And I think what I've dropped in a little bit to the left cliff in the shadow is going to be too light, but I'll blend it back in with some darks again. And you've got a ton of reflected light happening, and then some of that cliff actually emerging out of the shadows, so that is going to be placed eventually as well. There's some beautiful warmer green that is on the ridges of the cliffs. And some of that snow is still up there too. So you can see I've added that in already on the left side. I've dropped some of that sky color into them to try to communicate that reflected light and atmosphere. And now I'm again using the palette knife to go into this ridge line up here. The green gets more gray as it recedes, it loses saturation, so I can always add a little bit of a cad red into my green mixture to push it back and still make it feel warm. We have the tendency to sometimes just keep adding blue to our greens to make it recede, but using the cad red is a nice way to you know, show that it's still in light, but that it's receding. And dropping a little more cad yellow into the lower greens on the cliffs. And that feels as well like it's having a little more direct sunlight hitting it. And I'm going to go back into some of these really deep shadows there's the beautiful blue-green that actually has a lot of ultramarine and alizarin crimson. It almost has kind of a, black feature to it, but it's a lot cooler. I'm dropping a little bit of the yellow in to, help it to transition with the greens on the hillside. But I really feel that these are my darkest shadows, so going back into them again with those darks and that depth. And the palette knife makes it really easy to find your darks and reiterate them if they've, gotten other colors mixed in. And now I'm going into my lightest light on the cliffs. While I do feel that this gray-white matches the color in the scene very well, I feel like there's just a little bit more yellow-orange that I want to communicate in the rock. So this is a nice, really light gray to get down. You can see I've started with a palette knife, but now I've switched over to using my brushes and just loading the paint that I've mixed onto my brush. And because I've got so much kind of blocked around this shape in light, I feel like I can really go into it more with the brush. And now that I've got the brush, I'm actually taking that light mixture that I've created plus the dark rock mixture and mixing them together a little bit on the darker side to bring in some of those transitions a little more smoothly in the shadows. So darkening where I dropped in maybe the lights and they were too light, and just smoothing it out a little. You can get those really jagged, cool marks with the palette knife, but I do want the shadow to still recede. So I'm jumping over to a little bit of that snow that I laid in and dropping some of the sky mixture, the cerulean, into those dark blues that I used for the lower grasses, and then like a neutral white. Going back into this rock face where the edge of the shadow meets the lit face is a transition zone. So I'm mixing a little bit more of a middle to light and more orange, a little more saturation where those planes connect. And that really helps to read the shape. When you add those transitions, that makes it feel less abrupt and more naturalistic. That's something that I learned from my mentor, Bill Kramer, that has really helped me to model forms, is increasing the saturation in those transition lines. And these are all things that, you can try on your own and just estimate if it feels like the look that you're going for, if it matches what you're seeing. And if not, then just discard them. But, I've learned a lot of things where maybe they didn't quite stick, or maybe I had an aha moment. So, you take what kind of resonates, and then you can leave the rest, or they're all just tools for the toolkit. I've got a lot of these small rock features that are kind of connected to the bigger planes, so choosing which ones I want to model and which ones I want to leave out. So that's always a process, figuring out, what to include and what to leave out to make the painting feel cohesive, not too busy, not take away from your focus, but really just accentuate and complement it. And really now I'm just going back into a lot of the areas where I've used palette knife and smoothing them out with brushes, and, you know, adding little pops of reflected light or cracks in the rock. These light areas are really fun to lay in. They really start to bring the scene to life. And you can see how, you know, I map out where my lights are going to be in the beginning, but I typically save the areas of light for later on because I find it a little more challenging to, you know, get that lightness back or get the dark back if I've already put some light there. So I typically save the blocks of light for later in the painting. Definitely I save highlights for last. You can see I'm still going in on these rock faces with the brush. And some transitions where there's cracks in the rock, they don't have to be the darkest darks. Even if they appear that way, they can be more of a middle tone, and that still communicates the fissures in the rock. So you can see I've added a few of those lines in. There's a lot of additive and subtractive mark making in my painting, which I feel gives it movement in the end. And what I mean by that is I'll, you know, constantly adding things in and taking them out. And you have to be, you know, confident with paint handling to do that and not muddy the colors. So a lot of that just takes, you know, a lot of practice with painting, getting comfortable with the tools and paint application. But the palette knife is awesome. It allows you to scrape down and add in a way that you can't do with just layering thin to thick, which is what I normally do. You can also see that I've brought out where that rock is in light in the shadow. And it's important to note that I didn't create that light pattern in the beginning, because when you're starting out, the best way to see the values is to just create big masses and then go back into them and bring out areas that are getting hit with light. I'm taking the palette knife back out and I've added that stripe of green that's going across. And I feel that that's important for the scene because it really shows the direction of the rock plane. There's a lot of areas in the rock where some of those green patches are, but you want to just focus on putting a few of them in with intention so that, you know, it doesn't become too much information. And you can also see that I've added a little pop of that cliff in light with the palette knife, and now I'm integrating it with the brush into the shadow. In real time, more of that rock is in light, but I don't want to break up that mass too much, so I'm just gonna leave that one little piece of rock in light, and I've decided not to include the rest of it. And now I'm using the palette knife again to go back into these shadow planes where that rock is kind of turning and jutting out, and I've added some warmth into that. and that kind of just really nicely breaks it up from the background cliffs a little. And going into the hillside also, getting that information in is going to help me model these cliffs a bit more. So you can see I've added like more gray and blue into that green so that it falls back a little. And just a couple lines of where the plains in the hill kind of undulate, a darker blue-green. And it's windy, so you can see I'm kind of having to hold the panel to the easel when those gusts come through. So finishing blocking in this plane here, you can see that I'm kind of working with one section at a time. I'm not really layering it the way that I normally do because I've got the knife. But, you know, I'll bring everything to a level of finish towards the end once I've got it all covered. Added a little bit of snow to the top of that ridge, which is in light. And now I can focus on getting the greens into the foreground area. These are, you know, sort of a middle value. I know I kind of mentioned that I grouped the sky and the ground plane together in the same value group in the beginning, but now I can kind of play with that a little more. I would say the foreground plane is going to be probably a shade darker than the sky plane. But now, you know, I've got my value structure really figured out, so I can break away from those three groups a little more and kind of gauge it a little more accurately. You could easily work with 3 or even 2 value groups and have a very solid painting that reads. But I would say like less is more. If you're thinking of value zones, you know, the more you have, it's just the more information for the eye. And I really feel simplicity is the most moving and cohesive in a painting. The greens definitely shift a little throughout this ground plane. So you can see some of the hills have more gray, more blue. So, you know, neutral, warm, cool. I'm constantly looking at what's in front of me and asking, is that green more yellow? Is it more red? Is it more blue? Is it more of a neutral green? And anytime you're working with a green that feels more neutral, you add, you know, more red. Some of these greens that are really close up have a little more of that chroma, a little more of that yellow. Bringing that right into the front helps everything to recede a little bit too and create a feeling of recession in the hills. So you really kind of still get that vista feeling in the foreground, even though I'm just taking a piece of the scene. And I'm essentially doing the same thing when I'm gauging the colors in the rocks. I'm looking at them and I'm saying, is this, you know, more neutral? You know, sandstone color, does it have more gray in it? Is it getting hit more with light? Is the light more yellow or more white, more red, orangey? So I'm taking my palette knife. I've mixed some like a whitish gray yellow and hitting those highlights in the rock now. So you've got a couple things happening. You've got where the light is kind of hitting these planes more or less, and you've also got some of those stripes in the sandstone. And it's really helpful to go in with the highlights with a palette knife because I've already got a pretty thick layer of paint down. And if I just used a brush at this point, if it wasn't super loaded up, it can easily get muddied and can get pretty hard to get that highlight in unless it goes down right away. So the palette knife really allows me to layer on that paint and that highlight even if there's already a lot of paint built up. So this is a very sculptural process. Really feels like you're working with paint more like clay or something. So I'm at this point in the painting where now it's all there, and I will just kind of refine for the next little bit. I'll clean up the edges, whether I feel like they need to be hard or soft, go back into the shadows and, make them come forward or push them back, depending on the shading or the color I use. These little refining touches can make or break a painting, so it's really cool to see how that happens and how every mark really matters and why it's important to, save these refining touches for the very last 10% and not attempt it all in the beginning because you just don't have enough information in the beginning to start refining. I think that's the mistake that I make, that a lot of people make as we try to get into those details too soon. And, it just doesn't end up making any sense. So I really feel like this session I was able to have a really great order of operations, as Joshua Bean calls it in his book, Learn to See, Learn to Paint. And that's what I think helped it to really come together and have a richness and depth. And right off the bat, I had the composition and the values down, which is, I think, what you need to have a successful painting. If you don't have that right in the beginning, it can kind of just become a struggle for the whole session. And I think, the underground painting, the wash that I do, the sketch, and now, finding the main masses and darks with the palette knife, I think those are all things that really help me to get those components in at the beginning. This was a really fun session. The light kind of did go in and out a little bit with the clouds, but I got all my information down in those first 5 minutes, and every time the light came back out, I could work with it. So this was a super fun painting session, and I hope that, there were a couple things that you can add to your toolkit. I would highly recommend incorporating palette knife into your process, even in those first beginning stages, just to figure out your design and your values. So thank you so much for watching. Thanks for being a part of my journey, my little vlog, and I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your week. Happy spring equinox and happy full moon. See you next time.